Hey, Stepsters. I'm Lasya.
Can we redo that?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Hey,
Dexter.
Stepsters. I'm Lasya.
And I'm Kritika, and we're your trainers from Future Steps.
Today, we're going to be looking at ecology, which is the study of living things and their environment. Welcome to our journey through the fascinating world of ecology. We'll explore how living things interact with each other and their environment, discover the intricate connections that sustain life on Earth, and learn how we can become stewards of our natural world.
Okay, so let's get started with talking about the levels of organization in ecology. So we're going to start off from the smallest to the biggest. So the smallest is an individual, which is a single living organism, like an oak tree or a squirrel. And then that goes into a population, which is a group of the same species living in the same area. So, for example, like a oak grove or a squirrel family. And then that turns into a community, which is all populations interacting in an area. So, for example, a community would be all the oak trees, all the squirrels, all the birds, and all the insects, and all the other animals all together. And then the ecosystem is going to be the community plus its physical environment, like the forest with soil, water, and air. That is all combined to make it that all combined is going to make an ecosystem. And then there's a biome, which is which is a large or it's a large region with similar ecosystems. So, for example, like temperate forests, deserts, or the tundra regions. And then there's a biosphere, which is basically all places on Earth where life exists, which is crazy big. That is basically our entire Earth.
Now let's look at the different components in the ecosystem. So we have the biotic and the abiotic factors. So the biotic factors are all living organisms, plants and trees, animals and insects, fungi and bacteria. And then we have the abiotic factors. These are non-living organisms or non-living things. So sunlight, temperature, water, rainfall, soil, minerals, air, and wind. These are all abiotic factors that are present in an ecosystem. These factors constantly interact and influence each other. For example, the amount of sunlight, which is abiotic, affects the plant growth, which is biotic, which affects animal populations, so biotic. So you see how everything is interconnected in ecosystems? Even the non-living things are interconnected with the living things too.
hmm Now let's talk about food chains and food webs, which is our energy flow. I know we've talked about this for years now, but we're gonna keep talking about this because it's really important. And now we have one more thing added to our food chain and our food webs. So we start off with our producers, which are plants that make their own food through photosynthesis using sunlight energy. And see, that's where biotic and abiotic comes into. And then we have our primary consumers, which are herbivores that eat plants like grasshoppers, rabbits, or deers. And then we have our secondary consumers, which are carnivores that eat herbivores, for example, frogs and small birds. And now we also have something called the tertiary consumers, which are our top predators that eat other carnivores, for example, hawks and wolves, right? And then we have decomposers that break down dead organisms. And some decomposers are fungi, bacteria, and worms. Now, food webs are many interconnected food chains. About 90% of energy is lost at each level as heat. And we've talked about this earlier in one of our videos. So if you want, you can go check that out. And I'm pretty sure there's one whole video dedicated to food chains. So if you're still confused about that, you can go check that out. And isn't it crazy? Out of all out of your out of all the energy, only 10% is passed on. That's insane.
Now let's look at interactions in ecosystems. So we have competition, predation, and symbiosis. So competitions is when organisms in an ecosystem compete with one another for limited resources, like food, water, space, and mates. Example, two squirrels can compete against each other for the same acorns or birds competing for nesting sites. Then we have predation. Here, one organism, so the predator, hunts and eats another, so which is the prey. Example, catching and eating a mouse, or a ladybug eating aphids. And then we have the symbiosis. This is the close relationship between different species. We have three different types of symbiosis. We have the mutualism, commensalism, and the parasitism. The mutualism is when both the organisms benefit from the relationship, like the bee and the flower. So the bee gets the honey it needs while the flower gets pollination. Then we have the commensalism. Here, only one benefits while the other is unaffected. So, like birds nesting in trees, the birds get a nest and a home while the tree is unaffected. Nothing's gonna happen to a tree just because a bird put a nest on it. Then we have the parasitism. Here, one benefits, but the other is harmed. So, like the tick on the dog. So a tick, it benefits from the dog getting its food, right? From the dog, while the dog suffers because of the tick getting its blood or food from it.
Yep. Now we're going to talk about matter cycles. So the water and carbon cycles. So let's talk about the water cycle first. So as a cycle, it's basically think about it going in a circle. So first, water evaporates, so it turns into vapor from the heat, and then it condenses. So the vapor forms clouds, like you can see up here. And then there and then there's a process called precipitation, where the clouds release the water, so it rains or like snow that falls on earth. And then there's collection, where the water gathers back in oceans and lakes, and then it evaporates again because of the heat, turns into clouds, it rains again, goes back into the lake. That's why it's a cycle. And then we have the carbon cycle, which starts off with photosynthesis, where the plants take in CO2, and then we have respiration, where organisms release CO2, and then we have decomposition, which which basically returns carbon to the soil. And then there is human activity that adds extra carbon. So human activity and decomposition kind basically does the same thing. So organisms that release the CO2, the plants take that CO2 to make their own food, and then that carbon is released into the soil. Excess carbon is also released into the soil. And that way, once again, the carbon dioxide taken from this goes into the plants, into the soil. And sometimes that carbon from the soil can be used by humans for processing and machinery, but that we do not mention in the carbon cycle.
Now let's look at a fun experiment where you can observe decomposition. The materials you will need are three clear glass jars with lids, soil from outside, dried and fresh leaves, water spray bottle, a magnifying glass, and a notebook for observations. Now let's look at the setup. Fill each jar halfway with soil. Secondly, add different leaves to each jar. So add some fresh and dried leaves too. Thirdly, spray with water until slightly damp. So not a lot of water or not too less too. Just spray until the soil is a little damp. And then cover cover the jars with the lids that have small air holes. So you can just take a lid and put in some holes in it to make air holes and then put them on top of those jars. Lastly, label the jars with the dates. Now you're now you're gonna talk about how you observe the jars every week. So in your notebook, you can try drawing this table we have right now to record the observations that you go through every single week. So first we have the date and then we have the week. So it's basically you're taking the observations every week. You can do it maybe 3 or 4 weeks. Here we just have 2 weeks just to show you an example. And then you just talk about the changes in the jars. So maybe the jar one has maybe the leaves are dried up, like the fresh leaves are dried up, and maybe the dried leaves are like dissolved in the soil after week 2 or something like that. And just write small notes under each section to explain what happened to the leaves in that week, in that jar, in that specific jar. So questions to answer after all, like maybe 2 to 4 weeks. These are questions you can answer. So what organisms do you see? Do you see small insects like, trying to eat those leaves or anything like that? And how do the leaves change after weeks pass by? And which leaves decompose faster? Is it the dried or the fresh leaves? And try to think about why this is happening. Remember clue decomposition, okay? Just comment down below your answers to these after doing this experiment. And then just talk about why you think this is happening, okay? Why do you think the leaves are, changing week by week and what is causing this?
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the human impact on ecosystems. So there are definitely a couple negative impacts, such as deforestation that destroys habitats for thousands of species. And yes, deforestation can happen because of human error, especially because of human error. And then pollution contaminates air, water, and soil. And yes, that is also something we do by sometimes people throw in excess waste into water. And then because of factories, our air is getting polluted because of the smoke. And then a lot of people end up throwing plastics into water or just on the ground or on in like if you're in a forest, some people just end up throwing plastic bottles right into the sand, which is not good because plastic does not dissolve. That is why it could pollute our oceans, it could pollute our water and our soil and just destroy our nature. And then climate change alters temperature and precipitation patterns. And you're probably wondering, well, what do we have to do with climate change, right? Well, think about it. The pollution that we are causing can can change our atmosphere, which can end up changing our climate. And do remember, climate and weather are two different things. So when our climate changes, the temperature could go up or down, which can change our ecosystem because our ecosystem relies on our climate. And then overfishing depletes marine pollutions. A lot of people eat fish, and there is and the fish market has a really big economy and it's profiting a lot, right? So definitely we've been fishing and we fish a lot, but if we end up fishing too much, then we're going to end up getting rid of our marine populations. You could think of it as our marine populations going extinct. And then you're going to notice that over time, you probably aren't going to be able to fish because you don't have anything left to fish because you are fishing every day, every hour. And there are also a lot of fishermen. That's another reason. Now we can talk about some success stories. So, y'all know there is something called the Yellowstone wolf that reintroduced that. So, basically, there's a Yellowstone wolf, and a couple of you probably know about it, a couple of you don't. And when I first saw it, I was like, huh, what is a Yellowstone wolf? And I'm pretty sure a couple of you guys also had that reaction. So, our, this Yellowstone wolf reintroduction restored ecological balance. So basically, I think I mentioned this in an earlier video, where, in our ecology, a lot of different animals can get reintroduced and can reappear because it isn't like they're completely gone, but there is probably something of them that's left over. Probably like a really small population, so small that you can't really see them around. And then bald eagle populations also recovered after the DDT ban, which is really good because I know you guys probably know what a bald eagle is, because there were a lot of them and then they started decreasing and now they're recovering because of the DDT ban. And then no long are no giant pandas are no longer endangered due to habitat protection because a lot of the government has decided to put a protection protocol so that these animals can live without being hunted down. Because, oh, look, it's a giant panda. Why don't I hunt it down so I can showcase my piece? That's a lot of what hunters think like. That is why there are a lot of protocols enforced now. And then coral reef restoration projects showing promise. What this means is that there are restoration projects for coral reefs since a lot of them are disappearing because if you go underwater you are unlikely to see colorful reefs here and there, which is bad. But after these projects were shown, we're starting to see some good change. So these are some good impacts of human on ecosystems. Now, this is this is just like a fun fact. So the Yellowstone wolf reintroduction in 1995 triggered a trophic cascade. Wolves reduced elk populations, allowing willow and aspen trees to recover, which brought back beavers and created new habitats for fish, birds, and insects. If you didn't understand that, let me explain it in simpler words. So when these wolves came back, they started eating these elks. So now the elks are dying because they're being eaten by the wolves, right? And because the elks are dying, it's letting these willow and aspen trees to regrow because there aren't that many elks to, destroy it. And then after these trees grow, you know how a lot of tiny animals and birds they live on trees. Because of these trees regrowing, a lot of these new habitats are coming in. So like birds and insects, and then even fishes, because you know when there's a foresty area, it's probably going to need water, right? So there's going to be some sort of water source. And now that the trees are in danger, the water is also safe because the trees are stable, so the entire ecosystem is stable. And that's kind of how an ecosystem works because it's interconnected. If a couple of things are stable, then likely everything is going to be stable.
Okay, now we can talk about how resource availability affects populations. So there's carrying capacity and limiting factors. Carrying capacity is the maximum population size an environment can sustain with available resources. So if more than like the maximum population does occur in a place, there'd be a lot of competition and they'd be like predation a lot because other animals start to eat other animals for in competition for the limited resources that are available in that ecosystem. We have limiting factors, which also causes competition between these organisms that live in that ecosystem, which are like food availability, which determines energy for survival. And we have water access, which is essential for all life processes. We have space, which is needed for shelter, hunting, and breeding. And then we have diseases too, which can rapidly reduce populations too. So disease is like an effect of having a large population size in an ecosystem. That way, the disease can spread rapidly because there's a lot of population and there's a lot of relationship between those, right? And if you have a small population and you have a lot of space, then maybe they won't like, meet each other and they'll just stay in their own isolated space because the space is kind of large, right? But if you have a lot of population, they start to compete and then meet in each other's pace and everything. And that's how disease can spread too. So when resources are plentiful, populations grow exponentially. When resources become scarce, population decline through starvation, lower reproduction, or migration. And you can see the graph there. It shows the relationship between food size and the population size and the food availability. So as food availability decreases, the population size also decreases, right? And as the food availability is stable and it's kind of growing, the population also starts to increase.
Mhm. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about how we can get involved. So this is gonna be our mini ecologist challenges. So you can try these if you want, and it's a really good thing, so you should try them. So the first one is backyard biodiversity. Choose a small area in your yard or local park. Visit it 3 times over 2 weeks. Record all plants and animals you observe. Can you identify at least 10 different species? And remember, species can be anything, plants and animals. Note these down in a notebook, and then you can also comment down what you noticed. And then the second thing you can do is a food web detection. So, create a food web of your local ecosystem. Include at least 2 producers, 3 consumers, and 1 decomposer. Use string to show connections between organisms. So, if you do not want to get pictures like this one, you can just write down the name and put it up on your wall and then connect it with strings. Now, the third thing you can do is conservation action. So, join a local environmental cleanup event or start your own mini project. Plant native flowers for pollinators, build a birdhouse, or create a small wildlife habitat. And you can also do this to help your local animals, your local habitat. By the cleanup is a really good thing because a lot of people don't understand that a lot of the garbage that they end up tossing doesn't actually decompose or go into the soil like, natural waste would. That is why these cleanups can be really helpful for environment. So do that. And if you if you would like, you can comment down below any other projects so that people who are reading the comments could probably go do those too. And that is all we have for you today. We learned a lot about our ecology and our habitat and how we can protect it too. So it's your time to take action.
Yep.
Go go to a local cleanup, or you can even start your own cleanup. Send messages to your entire community. Or you could put up posters. And do remember, take those posters down after you're done, especially if you're using plastic tape. Because remember, plastic is not good. So that's all we have for you today. Try to do any of these you can and comment down below the answers to our questions, any comments, concerns, questions that you have for us,
Yep.
and any video requests. So we look at our comments, so you are safe. We will look at it for sure. So that is all we have for you today. See you in our next video then. Bye!
Bye, Stepsters.